In this video, I want to introduce you to a really important lost English structure, Old London Bridge. Until 1729, Old London Bridge was the only bridge that spanned the River Thames in England's capital. Unless you crossed by barge or by ferry, it was the only way to enter the City of London from the south. The nearest bridge to it was 10 miles upstream at Kingston upon Thames. Covered in many extraordinary buildings, it was one of the great engineering wonders of medieval and early modern London. The present London Bridge, which as we will see dates from the 1960s, is on a slightly different alignment to the medieval bridge it replaced. It is a little further west. The southern end of the medieval Old London Bridge was in Southwark, close to the Priory Church of St Mary Overy, now Southwark Cathedral, while the northern approach was right beside the church of St Magnus the Martyr, and in fact from the 1670s the entryway to Old London Bridge ran directly underneath the church tower. Now it isn't clear when the first crossing of the Thames was made at this point. It may well be as early as Roman times. We know from documentary evidence that a series of timber bridges were constructed in Saxon and Norman times. Some chroniclers relate that when King Canute invaded England in 1016, there was already a bridge here, and it was such an obstacle on the river that he had to construct a canal from Rotherhithe to Vauxhall in order for his ships to circumvent it. In 1133 or 1135, during a major fire that destroyed a large part of the medieval city, the then timber bridge was also destroyed. The last timber Old London Bridge, built of elm, was begun following this fire in 1163 at the instigation of King Henry II and under the supervision of a priest called Peter of Colechurch. The construction of a permanent stone London Bridge was commenced not long after that, in 1176, and again it was Peter of Colechurch who was tasked with overseeing this work. This work would take 30 years or so to complete. In 1202, Peter was nearing the end of his life, and the final phase of the construction work was overseen by a French monk called Isambert. According to the London historian John Stowe, the bridge, which had 19 narrow pointed arches, was completed in 1209. Now we know an awful lot about this wonderful structure architecturally, as it has been the subject of numerous drawings, paintings, engravings and prints between the mid-16th and the early 19th century. Constructing a permanent stone bridge in the late 12th and early 13th century across the broad Thames was a complex and laborious undertaking. The first part of the process was to drive hundreds of wooden piles into the riverbed to create wooden platforms or artificial islands called sterlings. The stone piers of the bridge were then constructed on top of these rubble-filled timber sterlings, and then these were topped with the sequence of pointed arches. The bridge was built at just the time when round-headed Norman arches were giving way to pointed Gothic arches, and these pointed arches gave the bridge added stability. The sterlings and arches were so well built that most of them stood the test of time and were still in position in the 18th century. The sterlings, combined with the narrow openings or locks between the piers, dramatically affected the flow of the River Thames at this point. The River Thames was tidal. The bridge created rapids to the east of it that were difficult to negotiate by boat. The London watermen were very skilled at shooting the bridge, as they termed it, without overturning their barges, but most passengers, including the King and the Royal Court, when the court chose to move to the Palace of Palencia at Greenwich, chose not to risk this rough ride and would instead get out of their barges at the Three Cranes Wharf, close to where the Cannon Street Bridge is now located, while the watermen negotiated the rapids before embarking once again on the other side of the bridge at Billingsgate. This slowing of the flow of the River Thames by the narrow arches also caused the river upstream to freeze during the mini ice age that lasted from the Middle Ages to the 19th century. It became something of a tradition for Londoners to take to the ice and for frost fairs to be held upon it, with plenteous food and ale provided and even printing presses set up in the middle of the solid river on which souvenirs were printed. Almost immediately after it was built, Buildings were constructed on the bridge itself, with shops and houses that created in effect a southern suburb of the city. On the wider central pier of the bridge, a chapel was constructed, founded by Peter of Colechurch himself, and in which he was buried at his death in 1205. This chapel was a large two-storey structure with a lower chapel or crypt built into the river pier and an upper chapel in the early English Gothic style. The chapel was dedicated to St Thomas of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, who was born in the parish of St Mary Colechurch, Peter's own parish. Peter may well have known the saint personally, and he had a strong devotion to him. The chapel was staffed by a small college of clergy, 2 priests and 4 clerks, who were known as the Brothers of the Bridge. In the 14th century, several chantry chapels were established in this space, endowed by Londoners, where priests could celebrate Mass for their souls, and this swelled the clerical staffing of the Chapel of St Thomas to the point where it became quite a substantial institution. The chapel contained numerous relics, including one of the True Cross. By the late Middle Ages, it was customary for pilgrims, like those in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, who had gathered at the Southwark inns before making for St Thomas's shrine at Canterbury, to hear Mass in the Chapel of St Thomas before they set off on their journey. The chapel's dedication to St Thomas of Canterbury ensured that at the Reformation the building quickly fell prey to the reformers' zeal. Henry VIII tolerated the chapel's continuance, but it was rededicated to St Thomas the Apostle rather than to Thomas Becket, who was considered a traitor by the king. In the reign of Henry VIII's son, Edward VI, the priests were all dismissed, and in 1553 the chapel was repurposed for secular use, and it was leased to a grocer who used the upper chapel as his shop and his house, and the lower chapel as his storehouse. The lower chapel survived into the 19th century and was only demolished with the rest of the bridge in 1832. As the bridge was the primary entrance into the City of London from the south, an effort was made to ensure that it was defensible. There was a small northern gate, but the primary defensive structures were all to the south. Midway along the southern section of the bridge was a gateway, and before it was what was termed a draw lock, where a timber drawbridge could be raised. In addition to keeping people out in times of trouble, this drawbridge also enabled larger vessels to move upstream beyond the bridge when the tide allowed it. In July of 1450, these defences were tested when a rebellion led by Jack Cade ended with a battle on the bridge itself. In 1305, a grisly tradition that continued until the late 17th century was begun when the head of the Scotsman William Wallace was displayed on a spike on the draw-lock gateway. And in 1450, Jack Cade would also have his head displayed on the bridge too, and heads of other traitors against the crown, including Sir Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell and Cardinal John Fisher, were similarly displayed in the reign of Henry VIII. The heads were parboiled in a tanning solution so that they could remain there longer. Now, in Wingard's drawing of the bridge made in the middle of the 1540s, perhaps in 1544, you can see all the spikes with heads upon them on top of the gate. Perhaps one of them there at this time was that of Thomas Cromwell. In the 1570s, this grisly display was moved to the medieval gateway at the bridge's southern end. The heads on spikes in this new location can be seen in Vischer's Panorama of London in 1616. The relocation of the head display was due to a major piece of redevelopment on the bridge. Around 1570, the medieval draw-lock gate was demolished, and in its place was erected a fantastical timber-framed building known as Nonsuch House. It was given this name as it resembled Henry VIII's palace of Nonsuch. The building was an early modern example of a prefab. The structure was prefabricated in the Netherlands and was then shipped to London and erected in 1577 over the roadway. The bridge itself was only 20 foot wide, and the house was considerably wider, and it overhung the bridge, cantilevered out from the pier and supported on great timber struts. 3 stories high, none such house had corner turrets with gilded weather vanes on the top. In the 1680s, on the south side of the main gate were affixed 2 sundials and a large inscription, "Time and tide stay for no man." It has been suggested that this glorious structure, which the Corporation of London paid for and erected, was built to act as the residence of the Lord Mayor. Another substantial timber-framed Elizabethan structure was erected between the drawbridge and the southern gate. This was Bridge House, which acted as the headquarters of the Bridge House Estates, a corporation or trust founded in 1282 to manage the properties and lands that had been bequeathed to maintain both the bridge and the Chapel of St Thomas. The Bridge House Estate still exists, with a portfolio of property and assets worth £1.5 billion, which are still used today to maintain the bridges in central London. Other improvement works were made over the centuries. In 1581, a German engineer, Peter Maurice, rented one of the northerly locks, and he installed there a large water wheel to pump river water into a water tower and then to the city. Between then and 1737, 3 more water wheels were fitted, providing foul river water to supply the needs of the populace of the burgeoning city. In the 17th century, the centre lock beside the chapel was remodelled to form a great lock through which larger vessels might pass. By the early 18th century, it was evident that this venerable bridge was ailing. In 1725, over half of the houses, including Nonsuch House, were lost in a fire, and although they were replaced by 1745, in 1756 the corporation decided to clear the bridge entirely and remodel it. In 1759, the Great Lock was replaced once again with a great arch to improve water flow. By 1761, all the buildings on the bridge had been cleared away, and under the architect George Dance, the carriageway of the bridge was doubled in width. Dance's work was a sticking plaster solution, and in 1799 the corporation launched an architectural competition for the design of a new bridge. The eventual winner of the competition, which lingered on until 1820, was the Scottish engineer John Rennie. He proposed the construction of a new bridge 100 yards west of the old in anticipation of the latter's demolition. The new bridge of 9 arches was finally begun in 1824, 4 years after Rennie's death, and under the direction of his son Sir John Rennie. It was completed in 1831. As part of its construction, grand new approaches to the north and south of the bridge were constructed, which even necessitated the demolition of the eastern medieval Lady Chapel of what is now Southwark Cathedral. Then, in 1832, when all the work was complete, Peter of Colechurch's 19 ancient and picturesque medieval stone arches were finally demolished. Rennie's bridge would not last as long as the bridge it replaced. Its arches were in turn replaced between 1967 and 1972 by 2 shallow concrete arches, although the 2 approaches to Rennie's bridge were on the whole retained. The demolished arches of Rennie's replacement bridge were sold in 1968 for $2,460,000 to an American oil magnate called Robert McCulloch, who then had them shipped to the United States and re-erected over the Bridgewater Channel at his development at Lake Havasu City in Arizona, which is where they still remain. The story goes that McCulloch thought he was purchasing the more iconic Tower Bridge, a story that has since been disproved. London was and is an ever-changing city, and I don't doubt for a minute that the present incarnation of London Bridge at this river crossing that dates back 1,000 years and perhaps beyond will not be the last. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.